All right, and we back. All right, now we are multiplying integers. First, let's talk about what an integer is, because an integer is a term that's thrown around a lot by math teachers, and you'll see it in math textbooks. And oftentimes people don't know what an integer is, but sometimes in class people are embarrassed and they don't know, they're not confident enough to raise their hand and say, what's an integer? So I'm gonna tell you what an integer is. An integer is a number that doesn't have a decimal or a fraction part to it. So for example, I'm gonna tell you what an integer is not. 3.6 is not an integer because it has a decimal part to it. 9.8 is not an integer. Pi, 3.14 is not an integer. All right. A number that has a fraction in it. 1/2 is not an integer. 3 1/2 is not an integer. 1 2/3 is not an integer. All of those numbers I named are examples of what is not an integer. So therefore you can deduce that anything that doesn't have a decimal or a fraction part to it is an integer. So like 6 is an integer. -6 is an integer. 58,000 is an integer. 2,700 is an integer. All of those types of numbers, right? 0 is an integer. The negative numbers are integers. The positive numbers are integers, as long as there's no decimal or fraction part. So what we got behind us is two integers that we're going to multiply together. Now, Asada, this dot is a multiplication sign, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, even though you might not see a multiplication sign that looks like that on your calculator, just know that this dot means multiplication. It's not a decimal point. If it were a decimal point, it would be lower and it would be near like the bottom of this number, right? But if it's like midway vertically, right? Midway between the numbers vertically, then that means it's a multiplication sign. So we're doing -25 times -48. Now, the purpose of this video is not really so much to show the technical method for manually multiplying numbers, but really this is more to talk about calculators, right? Because this is a calculator problem. -25 times -48. Now you might be wondering, why are those parentheses there? That's a good question. Why are those parentheses there? The parentheses are there because oftentimes we don't want the work to be too jumbled up, and we don't want a multiplication sign followed by a negative sign. So we put the parentheses to just show separation, to make it very clear that this -48 is separate and distinct from this -25, right? So now let's multiply. Now, Asada has a calculator. She has a TI-30 calculator made by Texas Instruments, right? So what she's going to do is she's going to type in -25. But here's the thing. You got to know your tools. If you got a Texas Instruments calculator, if you got a Casio calculator, if you got a Sharp calculator, if you got like whatever type of brand of calculator you have to become familiar with your calculator, because some calculators, if you're going to enter in a negative number, some calculators require you to type in the number itself first and then hit the negative sign. Notice what I just said. Some calculators will not allow you to type the negative sign first and then type the number in. So right now, if Asada tried to hit the negative sign, right, when her screen is clear, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. It's still going to be the 0 right there. But if she types in 25, go ahead, type in 25. So she types in 25, and then she hits the negative button. Now, make sure you hit the negative button, not the minus sign. The minus sign and the negative button are two totally different things. The negative button has a minus sign and a plus sign on it to indicate that we're dealing with going from negative to positive or positive to negative, because all numbers on calculators are assumed to be positive by default. So if you want to type in a negative number, that means you got to hit that button and let the calculator know that we're not dealing with a positive number. We're dealing with a negative number right now. So Asada should have -25 in the calculator. Then she's going to hit the multiplication button, which is going to be an X on most calculators, not a dot, right? It's going to be an X. And then she's going to do the same thing with -48. She's going to enter -48. So she's going to type in 48 and then hit the negative sign. And then hit the equal sign. And that's 1,200, right? Okay. Yeah. So the other thing that I want you to also know is that there's a rule that is applied to multiplication and division, which is when you're multiplying two terms or two numbers, if the signs of the numbers are the same, your answer is always going to be positive. Your answer is always going to be positive. Meaning if you're doing a negative times a negative, your product is going to be positive. if you're doing a positive times a positive, your product is going to be positive. So this is not going to be negative 1200. It's going to be positive 1200. Right? So that's also something for you to memorize. All right? Negative 25 times negative 48 is going to give you positive 1200. Right, Izada?
Mm-hmm.
Are you paying attention?
Yeah.
I got to tell you one more. Pay attention.
I can hear you.
So we got positive 1200, right? So because we had a negative times a negative, which gives you positive 1200, not negative 1200. Now, this rule also applies to division, like we just talked about, right? Right, Asada? If you're dividing two numbers, if their signs are the same, then the quotient, that's the term we use to describe the answer to a division problem, the quotient is also going to be positive. All right? So now, but if the signs were different and you were dividing, then the quotient would be negative. All right? So, a couple takeaways from this video. A negative times a negative is always a positive. A negative divided by a negative is always a positive. Also, know your calculator. Know your tools. If you use an iPhone to do calculations, on an iPhone, as an example, on the calculator app as an example, you gonna pick that up? If you use an iPhone, right? And let's say you turn it sideways, whether you have it vertically upright or you turn it sideways to turn on the scientific calculator feature, right? It doesn't matter on that particular calculator app if you type in the negative sign first or the negative sign after the number. With the iPhone, it doesn't matter. But again, that's just an example of knowing your tools. That's an example of knowing your tools, right? She almost fell. I promise you I didn't push her. You saw my hands, right? But anyway, yeah. So just know your tools. Negative times a negative is a positive. And become familiar with your calculators. Know how they work and know how they operate, because it would be a shame for you to really understand the math, but then still get questions wrong just because you put something in the calculator the wrong way. If you put information into the calculator the wrong way, then the calculator will end up doing something that you do not want it to do. You have to familiarize yourself with your calculator, right? I know it's the beginning of the school year right now, and a lot of people are getting their school supplies. You got to take the time to get to know your calculator. Understand how it works. Learn how it works. All right? I hope this helped. You got any last words before we end the video?
No.
All right. Until next time, go get some practice. Go do a bunch of multiplication problems with negative numbers. And please familiarize yourself with your calculator.